So Bamboozle, the perk, is actually more harmful than good for you as a killer. Also, Spirit Fury, is it good, bad, healthy for the game? Let's talk about it. Alright guys, so this video is just going to be dedicated to me discussing this. This is a pretty interesting topic that I've talked about a bit, and I have some pretty strong opinions on these. Some opinions that a lot of people will probably, you know, disagree with, but I'm okay with that because I think it's some pretty interesting points, and at the very least, even if you disagree with me, I think it at least gives you something to think about, and I think it's a new perspective on things that you might not have really realized. So I'm going to talk about some things real quick as far as why I think Bamboozle might actually be a bad perk. And what I mean by a bad perk, meaning not only is it not an effective perk to run, but it's also more so that it literally hurts you more than it helps you, I think. And Spirit Fury being OP, spoiler alert, it's not OP, but I'm going to explain my feelings on Spirit Fury because a lot of people seem to think, a lot of people have been speaking for me with Spirit Fury and trying to tell people what I think about it, and it's usually inaccurate, so I just want to get my thoughts out there and discuss it. So just to quickly cover again what Bamboozle and Spirit Fury do for anybody that maybe doesn't really know off the top of their head, or maybe you're confused. Bamboozle is a perk where you vault the window as killer 15% faster, so you go through the window faster, but on top of that, it also blocks the window that you vault for 16 seconds after the vault. These are all values at tier 3, by the way. I won't be doing tier 1 and 2 values because I don't think it really matters. And Spirit Fury is a perk that involves pallets. Basically, the way it works is that when you break 2 pallets, it charges up. And then once it's charged up, the next time that you would get stunned by a pallet as killer, the pallet actually breaks during the stun animation. This is pretty much exclusively run with the perk Enduring too, by the way, which reduces the pallet stun like pretty much in half and makes the stun basically non-existent. It's like a less than a second stun. Which basically means that if a survivor gets a pallet stun, they don't really stun you. They break the pallet, and then you go through like a half a second animation, and then you can just hit them pretty much right away. Okay, so first thing, let's talk about Bamboozle. Bamboozle is actually a perk that I think, in my personal opinion, is more harmful than it is helpful when you're playing the game at a high level. It's very important to keep that in mind that I'm only talking about very high level play. I'm not talking about... Like, in most games, this probably won't be relevant, but if you're somebody that's striving to be a very, very, very high-skilled, high-level killer, and you're planning on doing your best against other high-level players, like high-level survivors, this will be really important to learn. Okay, so the way that maps work and the way they play out at high levels is obviously there's windows and pallets that survivors can use to get away. The pallets that spawn on maps are generally so safe that you have to kick them as killer. You force them to be thrown, and then you have to kick them and move on. Whereas the windows that spawn on a lot of these maps are actually pretty fair, and they have a decent bit of counterplay. For instance, in this clip, it's going to show you that this long wall jungle gym here, the way the window is, you can actually get hits on this window if you just predict the vault correctly. If you run around, show your red light, bait them into vaulting, and then meeting them at the other side, it's an easy hit. And then this is where Bamboozle comes into play. Now, if you're running Bamboozle, what you do here is you don't mind game it, and you instead vault the window to block it, right? And then the survivor can't use the window anymore, which forces them to have to use the pallet. They see that the window's blocked, and it forces them to run to the pallet. And this is actually bad as killer, because there is no counterplay for these pallets. There's no way for you to get hits on these pallets if the survivor is like even remotely good at the game. They will just stay here and force you to break it, and they won't leave until you break it, and you can't do anything until it's broken. It's important to keep in mind that while, yeah, this could be useful for getting pallets out of the map quickly, if you just wanted to break as many pallets as you can, this could definitely be useful for that because you're definitely forcing pallet throws where they might be able to loop them a little bit longer otherwise. But the problem with this is that if all you're doing is breaking pallets but not actually getting any hits or downs, the entire time you're doing that, the person that you're chasing's 3 teammates are all going to be doing generators. And we all know how quickly generators can get done if all 3 people are working on them. So if your strategy is just kick as many pallets as you can in the early game, by the time all the pallets are broken, all the gens are going to be done as well, and it's not really a reliable strategy. This can work sometimes if your build is based on game slowdown, but even then it's super risky because survivors that know how to do the objectives fast are just going to get them all done. This is where you hear a lot of people complaining about things like gen rushing because they just aren't applying map pressure and they're instead just kicking pallets over and over again. I want to also just throw out there that this isn't some just niche situation where it's only one tile on a map that does it, because Shack is a really good example of another one. Shack spawns on almost every map, and believe it or not, Shack does have counterplay. A lot of people don't really take the time to invest in getting good at Shack play, but you can absolutely get hits on good survivors at Shack if you know what you're doing. But again, just like the jungle gym, if you use Bamboozle and just block the window, all that does is force the survivor to go to the pallet, which forces a kick, and then they get a bunch of distance on you, and the whole time that this is happening, their teammates are all doing gens, and you're not really applying any map pressure whatsoever. I will take a second, though, and admit that Bamboozle is definitely amazingly useful for these windows, which a lot of people refer to as infinites or long windows or time wasters. These windows that have basically no counterplay and survivors can loop over and over and over again with no chance of getting hit is definitely an amazing spot to run Bamboozle, and that's absolutely where value from this perk comes from. But keep in mind that these windows only exist on some maps and not all maps, and even on the maps that they do exist on, I definitely have played many games on the maps where the windows don't even come to play very often at all. That being said, they are extremely frustrating to deal with if the survivors are using them a lot, and if you're running Bamboozle strictly to counter these windows, then that definitely makes sense to me. I overall find Bamboozle to be a pretty awful perk, and I feel actually worse when I run it. I think the bonus 15% to vault speed could be really useful for mind games if it didn't block the window, but unfortunately with Bamboozle blocking the window, all it really does is force the survivor to go to a pallet, and then the vault speed doesn't really end up affecting your play at all anyway. I do also think, though, that if you're playing the game at a lower level, it can definitely throw off a lot of survivors and a lot of people that aren't really aware of it or don't really know how to play pallets properly or are kind of just bad at the game and autopilot their way through maps. You can definitely get a lot of things with Bamboozle that you wouldn't be able to get without it. But if we're talking about it high-level play against good survivors, it definitely does more harm than good. It forces them away from the windows, which is where you're able to get hits, and forces them into pallets where you're unable to get hits, which I think is pretty much just terrible. I would highly recommend not getting into the habit of using this perk often because I really do think in the long run it's going to do you more harm than good. Okay, so let's talk about Spirit Fury. I have a lot of thoughts about this perk. So, as I said earlier, the way it works is a pallet breaks over your head during the stun, and if you combine it with Enduring, you can see above that the survivor gets like basically no distance even though they get the pallet stun on you. Now, just right off the bat, this just feels like unhealthy gameplay for me. Just as a general rule for DBD, if the survivor makes it to the pallet and then gets the stun on you as a killer, that has always been a good thing for survivor. And there's a lot of situations as survivor where getting the stun is kind of necessary to the correct play that you should do. So it's kind of this weird situation where the game ends up punishing the survivor for getting the killer stun, even though that's what you're supposed to be doing as a survivor. On top of that, it also rewards like a very no-brain killer mindset where you can kind of just hold W at pallets without really having to use your brain or trying to outplay the survivor at all and then get rewarded by getting free hits. Now, obviously, the counterplay to this, which I'm sure everybody is probably screaming into their monitor right now, is that if you know a killer has Spirit Fury, you pre-throw pallets, right? Well, first off, how do you know a killer has Spirit Fury until you get hit by it once? So you can't just assume every killer has Spirit Fury and pre-throw every pallet because that's terrible pallet use and you'll run out of pallets super quickly. And second off, if somebody does know about Spirit Fury and they want to counterplay it by pre-throwing every pallet early, that just turns the game into this terribly stale gameplay because most of the play in chases comes around the looping. If you're looping around a tile, the killer can mind game it and try to get hits on you before you get to the pallet, especially structures that have line of sight blockers, and all of that goes away if survivors are just pre-throwing pallets. If a survivor is just forced to get to the pallet, throw it, and then stay there until the killer is forced to kick it, that takes away pretty much all the chasing mechanics of the game, and it just becomes going from one pallet to another over and over and over again. On top of this, this also completely fucks over the actual like good pallets that exist on maps. The unsafe pallets or the fair pallets, the ones that normally have a lot of play around them, they become completely useless for survivors and you can't use them at all. Okay, so quick class on unsafe pallets. Unsafe pallets like this one, basically the way you have to play them as a survivor is you have to bait the killer into getting stunned, and then during the stun animation, you have to leave the pallet and get somewhere else. If you stay at this pallet and try to play it after it's thrown, you will get hit. That's the idea of it being unsafe. That is the general rule for unsafe pallets and how you play them as survivor. Now, when you add Spirit Fury into this mix, it just makes it so that you can't do anything. You're just completely screwed. Which I know some of you might just say, oh, well, Tofu, you know, that's part of the game. Sometimes as a survivor, you just die, and sometimes the killer just kills you, and blah, blah, blah. But for me, personally, the play around unsafe pallets is some of the most interactive and fun play in the game. It's some of the only places where the killer actually has a really good chance to outsmart the survivor, but the survivor still has a slight chance to outplay the killer, and it's actual fair gameplay on both sides. It's one of the only things in chases that is actually truly fair, and it's such a fun part of the game that having it being completely ruined by Spirit Fury is honestly heartbreaking. So here's the situation. You add Spirit Fury into this mix, and what do? You have to be so afraid of the lunge reaching to the pallet that you got to throw the pallet so early that a lot of times the killer can just go back and forth and get an easy hit. If you play it like you normally would without Spirit Fury existing and you get the stun and try to go to the next tile during the stun, he just walks right through it and gets a hit, even if the next tile is extremely close. If you try to throw it extremely early and then, just try to stay at the pallet and play it, the pallet is obviously unsafe, so then you find yourself just getting hit anyway. Even trying to pre-throw the pallet and then just leave the tile and go to the next one just to use it for distance, a lot of the time will not work because the killer can just go around without really having to commit to the pallet at all, and then you don't really get enough distance to get to another tile a lot of the time. So these pallets end up going from some of the most fair and fun gameplay that you could find in chases to just completely impossible to play from the survivor point of view and just a free win from the killers. Now, this might not be a huge deal, but if you pay attention to the new beta map that came out and how the map reworks are supposedly going to be coming, there's going to be a lot more fair to unsafe pallets where this kind of play is what's encouraged. Fair gameplay from both sides. And Spirit Fury is going to sway that into being just completely unfair towards the killer side. Now, with all that being said, all that stuff that I just named is stuff that I think makes it unhealthy for the game, as far as just general health and quality of life of the game. When it comes to its power, I do not think it's overpowered. I want to throw that out there right now. I do not think it's overpowered. Obviously, putting on Enduring and Spirit Fury takes up 2 of your perk slots, which is kind of a big deal, and there is counterplay to it, where you can just pre-throw pallets. There's enough safe pallets on most maps right now that the unsafe pallet situation will come up very rarely, and a lot of the times you could just go from safe pallet to safe pallet, and a lot of the time it ends up just feeling like you wasted 2 perk slots. My overall opinion on the perk is that it's just not fun, and it's not healthy. This is why you'll never see me running it. See, for me, I would rather earn hits. I would rather actually mind game tiles and try to outplay the survivor and outsmart them, because that feels more rewarding when you get hits. You actually feel like you earn them. Whereas when you throw on Spirit Fury and you just hold W and don't really use your brain at all and then get rewarded, it doesn't really feel deserved. I don't really feel proud of myself as far as playing. Now, you guys are completely free to disagree with me on that front as well. I know that a lot of you might feel okay about getting hits with Spirit Fury, and I do know that survivors do have a lot of things themselves that feel kind of cheap, and when you deal with that a lot as a killer, you're just like, why the hell would I not use the things that I have? So I totally understand the mindset. I totally get it. Trust me. I'm not trying to knock anybody that use Spirit Fury. If you want to use Spirit Fury, go ahead. This is more just me explaining my thoughts on it as far as overall health of the game, and also why you don't see me running it as killer very often. So hopefully all this ranting I've been doing makes some sense to you guys. Feel free to please discuss this in the comments. Let me know what you guys think. I'm actually really curious. I know a lot of you guys are gonna disagree with me, but that's okay too. I'm totally cool with you guys disagreeing. I'm totally cool with having a discussion about it. But thank you guys all so much for watching. I hope you guys at least learned something about this, and hopefully you guys at least got your eyes open a little bit about Bamboozle and Spirit Fury and whether they're good or bad or whether to run them, because I think it is a really interesting topic to talk about. And I'm going to get out of here. Hope you guys have a good rest of your night. Feel free to sub to the channel if you guys enjoyed the content, because I will have more. And I'm getting out of here. Have a good rest of your night. See you later. See ya. I'm out of here. Take care. See ya. See you later. See ya.